morning or afternoon or evening or middle of the night, wherever you are. The fantastic part about this conference is that we are spread out all over the world, which, I sometimes it means I'm here at 3 in the morning. That'll be tomorrow. But it also means that there are those of us who know how important pride in education is all throughout the world, which means that even if you are the only one where you are, or you think you're the only one where you are, you've got a whole web and network of all of us. So please make sure that you're reaching out to all of us. If you, after we're done for the day, take a look at the program, you'll see everybody's names. Pretty much everybody everywhere now has social media. So come find all of us. You'll be able to find what we all do. But if you don't want to wait, now is the time to get to hear about everybody on this panel. I am leading the panel, taking over from our brilliant maestro. And my name is Chris Shane. I have written a book called The Educator's Guide to LGBT plus Inclusion. And that book really teaches somebody how to go step by step from knowing nothing about our topic area to becoming enough of an expert in the space to really advocate for youth. So it covers the kindergarten through high school graduation years, and it focuses in starting at the very beginning. So for someone who doesn't know exactly what the word gay means, which for those of us in the room, it often seems really silly, but I've spoken at events where we've spent 45 minutes just taking apart the word gay and what it means and what it used to mean and what does the research show and how is the word gay different from the word lesbian and what the heck does that word transgender mean that they've heard but they don't know. All of those things often feel really scary for people who don't already know. And often people feel really stupid for not knowing, so they don't ask. And so when they feel dumb and they don't ask, they avoid the topic. And what we know is that when you avoid a topic and you don't get educated, you avoid people and people can feel left out. That can then translate into feelings of self harm and suicidality. So this book starts at the very, very beginning and is really great for people who work in education. And also, I'm hearing a lot that people who have kids or people who have a kid that they love have been buying it. I've been hearing from parents and guardians that when their kid came out, instead of sharing the same story a million times and answering all the questions a million times, they sent a copy of the book to all of the family members and said, read the book. We'll talk in a week and have, or a month or whatever it was, and have another conversation. But then they can talk about their child instead of having to explain everything there is to know about being an LGBT plus kid. So that's my foundational work. I have backgrounds, advanced degrees in mental health and in education. And I am finishing up a PhD in leadership, specializing in education. I've got a second book also that came out that's a little separate from our conversation today that is to do the same in the business world. So, current or future business leaders, people who don't work in education that also want to make their spaces more inclusive, that book is for them. Apparently, my dog has decided to jingle his collar and say hello because this kind of a conference is so exciting that whether you're human or canine, you cannot help but try and be involved. Ace, I would love to hear from you about who you are and what you've been working on.
Good morning. Well, for me, it's good morning. Hello, everybody. My name is Ace Schwartz. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs, and I am videoing in from the unceded lands of the Lenni Lenape, which is commonly known today as Philadelphia. And I am a middle school science teacher. I teach 6th and 7th grade, or secondary school, I believe it's referred to in the UK. And I've been teaching for 6 years. I am a trans non-binary educator. And I'm also aromantic and asexual, and these identities I am very open about with my students. And I really got my start, my kind of journey, when I was, figuring out my identity after college, and I used my Instagram to kind of share my coming out journey and my transition, and like the successes and also the fears, and it really resonated with a lot of people. So my personal Instagram page turned into something like way bigger than I could have ever imagined, and it became teaching outside the binary. And so, on top of sharing my story and my journey, I also do a lot of education for educators, caregivers, administrators, basically anybody who's willing to listen on LGBTQ plus inclusion. So whether it's defining vocabulary terms or sharing like challenges. For example, I recently shared an experience going to the doctors and how transphobic it was and harmful, and why, like this stuff does happen, and people who are cisgender don't have to think about it in the same way that folks who are transgender do. So it's kind of been that, sorry, I'm in the middle of a move, so I'm actually like on my couch because the rest of my apartment looks atrocious. So I apologize for the wiggling of the screen. But yeah, a lot of education, a lot of sharing, and I create resources as well to help educators. And something that I'm really proud of is the Get to Know You sheet that I created. Folks have been asking, how do you ask your students for their name and pronouns? And I shared this like half sheet Google Doc. I'm not a very fancy person, and it wound up taking off. I guess it really resonated with people, a way to safely ask kids for their names and pronouns. And so it's kind of turned into this much larger thing than I could have ever imagined. And so there's that, and I have a resource for scientists learning about different scientists who aren't, the typical white male Eurocentric that we only learn about in schools. I offer support and consulting work. So it's really kind of been a neat journey just to see how all of this has evolved over the last, I guess, 2 years. It's been a very, very cool and interesting journey. But I love being in the classroom. I love being a teacher and being authentically me with my students and being that support to my students. So as much as I love Instagram and the education, I do really love being a classroom teacher. And when I teach, I kind of want to be the teacher that I never had growing up. I never had a queer role model. I never saw somebody who felt like me or looked like me, as an educator. And so I just want to be that for somebody else, and let kids know that they're not alone and that you can grow up and be a queer adult and be happy. Not that there aren't any challenges to that. And I'm very open to with my students about some of those challenges, but also the successes, because I think both of those things are really important. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And I see in the comment about the Get to Know You sheet, there is a copy available on my website, teachingoutsidethebinary.com. All these resources that I mentioned are on that website. Y'all are more than welcome to use them, adapt them, with credit. So yeah, I know I have like a minute and a half left, but that's a good summation of my work. So do I tap somebody else? Correct?
That is fantastic. And I love that we're already just in our panel, we're weaving in together. I'm excited to check out your Get to Know You sheet. I've got one in my book also. And we'll be talking a little bit later about sort of each of our experiences as we have more of a conversation once we know who everybody is. But one of the people we don't yet know is David. Tell us about yourself, David. Welcome.
Hi. Okay. Hi. Good afternoon. It's past 3 p.m. here in South Africa. I'm a lawyer and a novelist, presently pursuing my doctorate in human rights. My focus is really the use of interrogating the potential of indigenous storytelling as a tool for queer rights advocacy in Nigerian classrooms. And transcripts in Nigerian classrooms. And I come coming from a law background and interested in queer rights advocacy in classrooms makes me, or rather has pushed me towards more interdisciplinary study and understanding of queer rights advocacy as not just being illegal legal intervention, but more along the lines of social psychology. On the African continent, we have the African Commission, which is really an international human rights body, similar to the UN. It's from the AU. It's from the African Union, but for the continent. And the Commission addresses human rights issues on the continent. So it has, state delegates from all over. And a few years ago, they came together to agree on a resolution 275, that calls on all African states to condemn violence and stigma towards queer persons generally. And we know that Nigeria is one of the hotspots for homophobic violence on the African continent. Several studies have been conducted across Nigeria, particularly in the schools, in universities, to show that universities are a very hot site for homophobic prejudices and violence and mental health issues of queer persons. So I came to the scene really to take the studies a step further, to offer it's a suggestion, more or less. There's a way to say that there is a way to push past just taking stock of where we are and actually do something about it through indigenous storytelling. And indigenous storytelling is really the use of narratives, leveraging narratives about us to let us know more about ourselves. So it was really stories about queer persons in your community taken to university classrooms. And the grounding for this was theoretical frameworks such as contact theory, imagined contact theory, that with the logic of the more you know about a person, the more intergroup biases reduce. Also, there was the angle of decolonization, particularly through intimacy and being sensitive to the control of knowledge that has stifled inclusion in places like the African continent. So what I did was I took surveys before and after the storytelling intervention, and I also conducted focus groups during the intervention. The intervention was in 3 parts. It was one story, one main character, for 3 parts. And these 3 parts kind of fleshed out the various layers of her identity and the various grounds on which a person can be violated. The first one was on gender-based violence. The second one was interfaith violence, and the third one was homophobic violence. And what I realized, or what is coming from my study at this point, I'm running off my analysis now, is that attitudes towards queer persons in spaces that are very exclusionary are really on a continuum, especially when you come, especially when there's a place with lots of prior homophobic conditioning. And when people come to the point of being part of a storytelling intervention, or experiencing art, for instance, they all arrive at the scene at different spots in the level of acceptance. And so expecting that the art would be this magic one to immediately turn things around and bring everyone to the same spots is very Herculean. So I think it's more valid and more realistic to expect that the art is just going to push people further along the continuum. In the preliminary survey, I saw people who would say, "Oh no, if I found out that my sibling was queer, and perhaps beaten up for that, I would join in the beating to either punish my queer sibling or deliver my queer sibling from his, has, or their queerness." But towards the end, we saw the same people coming to the point of, okay, I think I would talk to my queer sibling about his queerness. I do not believe that they should be violated. So that's a step. I think that's a step past violence as expressed, physical violence, but it's not full acceptance yet. Nonetheless, it's an important step to record towards acceptance of queer persons in a space like Nigeria, where we have over 200 cases of violation every year. Another thing that has come up from my study is the importance of understanding the the practical scope of storytelling. It's important to know that when a queer story is told, so many things are at play or should be at play. The more the community is involved in co-creating the story, the more it takes on a life of its own and becomes more culturally significant than when it's just a one-way monologue. Also, we should understand that there are political processes involved in storytelling, such as how the story gets out, accessibility, funding, whether it's allowed by the law into certain certain spaces. But I think in conclusion, the biggest lesson that I've learned is that it's important for stories to take on a life of their own through being put out there for everyone to interact with, for everyone to use, and that we should leverage more intersectional identities than single identities of queer persons. Thank you.
There's so much amazing stuff to unpack. I'm excited for our conversation, but we can't start it until we know who Ariana is and what they're up to. Good morning or afternoon or evening.
No, good morning. It's 8 a.m. in Mexico City. So yeah, it's early. I cheated and I pre-recorded mine just to make sure I stayed within time and just in case of any internet issues, because here in Mexico, internet is very spotty. So I'm
Rihanna, do you want me to share or do you want to do it? Is your internet stable? I'm happy to help.
It is stable for now, so I think I can share. I guess not a lot of people are awake at 8 a.m. So the internet is working okay. Okay.
Hi, I'm Mariana Sacristan, and I'm a member of the Fuerte Claro Collective, which is a collective based in Mexico City, Mexico, that wants to teach about sexuality and gender through theater. Mexico is a country that has some laws protecting LGBTQ people, but it still has a long way to go. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage was constitutional, but only 23 of our 32 states have actually included that into their constitution. 50 states allow for same-sex adoption. 15 states allow for changing your gender on official documents. And all 32 states have laws protecting against discrimination for LGBTQ people. However, one thing is the law, and the other is society itself. For example, from May of 2020 to April of 2021, there was 87 hate crimes against LGBTQ people reported in Mexico. And this is just considering the cases that were actually reported and classified as a hate crime. The Collective Fuerte Claro started because of all these things, but also because a group of us from the LGBTQ community got together and we were talking about our sexual education that we had in school. And we realized that our sexual education really talked about sex from a biological point of view. However, for us, sex has an entirely emotional component that is so important. And that emotional side also includes sexual orientation, gender identity. And none of this is talked about in the Mexican curriculum, but we found out that in many countries, this is not a part of sexual education. So we decided to use theater, because a lot of us are theater makers and actors, to use it as a catalyst tool to be able to approach a subject that is so taboo in our society and in so many other societies around the world, to be able to break and melt away the ice when talking about these topics. So what we did is we put a Facebook questionnaire and asked people to share with us their sexual experiences discovering their sexual orientation and their gender identity. And then we use those testimonies to create a scripted conversation interwoven with fictionalized scenes and also dramatized testimonies to be able to talk about sexuality from the point of view of sexual orientation, gender identity, consent, and how to have healthy relationships, in order to really cover sexuality from the point of view of oneself. So how to be able to identify what it is that we like and we don't like, where our limits are, also about our own pleasure and being able to advocate for that pleasure and for our own limits. So what we found by doing this play is that it really helps to open up the conversation, because first students live it through the fiction of the play, and they can see how we've normalized all these topics, and we talk about it without there being any taboos attached, which I think really helps after the play when we have a conversation, for the conversation to be a lot more open and for students to be much more willing to ask questions. And we also use inclusive language throughout the entire play, and we don't even need to explain it. We just use it and normalize it, so that when after the play we have a discussion, all these themes have already been opened up in a way that's accessible to them. For example, we've done it with some schools where students have told us that their parents, whenever there is a scene of like a homosexual scene, for example, that they say that that's an abomination, they make them close their eyes, they tell them that that is, you know, something that they shouldn't see. And when we talk about it in such a normal way, it really shocks them and really starts them questioning. And I think that's what we want. We want to plant the seed to open up the dialogue. Our title actually as a collective, Fuerte y Claro, means loud and clear. What we want is for the conversation to continue, for it not to be hidden. And what we say in the workshop that we give is everything that is personal, that is said in here, stays here, but everything that is learned here, we want you to go out and tell people about it. And because of the pandemic, we actually had to adapt this workshop to a Zoom version. So we actually pre-recorded some scenes and the others are live through Zoom, which also has opened the doors to be able to reach other places in Mexico, but also in other countries. We've now performed in Colombia, and we have performances coming up in Ecuador, in Peru, in Argentina. So it has really allowed us to reach a wider audience and to be able to connect with students around the world.
So yeah, that was my presentation.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like, and probably, you know, I'm guessing on this one, age-wise and timing-wise, I've been doing this work almost 30 years now, and I've found, at least in the US, that in some ways we've moved a lot. We've moved from this was something we never spoke about to Will and Grace, for example, on TV, and Modern Family, and there are Disney cartoons that have same gender parents, and conversations last week tonight with John Oliver, which is a super popular news, but also sort of jokes involved kind of show here, and is on YouTube, has done full stories on sexuality and the way it's taught in America and often not taught in America. And they've talked about transgender rights and the issues happening in this country. Even though some of those stories were recorded about 5 years ago, I still have students, when I teach human sexuality at the graduate level, watch those videos and talk about how much has not yet changed. So I'm wondering, I know Ace had mentioned it's been a few years for them. What have you seen that's changed since you've started, Ace?
Oh, wow. I think like the vocabulary and like knowing what different terms mean has been kind of a big shift. I feel like something I don't have to explain like what pronouns are anymore, or like, you know, I think it's becoming more part of our like society, or it's being discussed more, whereas before it was like something that people either didn't know or just didn't want to talk about. So I think it's just kind of uh there's some pieces that, you know, it feels like I was doing a lot of intro stuff, and now I can do a little more deep diving into topics and ideas, because that foundation is there for a lot of people.
I love that. I love too that language evolution is something we're all collectively, and probably really everyone in the chat and in the room, we're in this very privileged position that we are old enough to remember when things were different, and we're young enough to be able to tell people in the future what it used to be. And I think there's something so cool about getting to be a part of it and also getting to bear witness to it. In the US, for example, for a long time, we used male to female transgender or female to male transgender. And the thought at the time, that was the polite language. The thought at the time was, you used to be male, now you're female, or you used to be female, now you're male. And we've since realized, actually, no, you've always been who you are. We as a public just didn't know that detail yet. And so we've started to use assigned female at birth, or assigned male at birth, or assigned gender at birth. And it's even adding in, although I'm an American, we heard earlier in the conference from Sue Sanders. And Sue has given me one of my favorite words that I am always talking about because I want it to catch on. We've long used the word normalize. And Sue has taken that word away. Instead of realizing or calling something, we're making this normal, which would then mean it didn't used to be. Sue uses usualize, and I'm completely obsessed. It was something that Sue had said in a sentence at a conference. We were on a panel together, and it was not good that I was on camera because I became an emoji face at the hearing of that word. It was just like, oh, like greatest word. I never thought about how harmful the word normalize was until I heard somebody say it differently. And I think it's fantastic that we get to pull from each other. We get to pull from our language changing. There's some conversation in the chat about some people who are not fluent Spanish speakers. My Spanish is garbage, absolute garbage. I would say basura, it's probably more like mierda. And so for Ariana to be sharing what that's like in a Spanish speaking country, in a Spanish language, and what that looks like when we try to translate from the way it's created in Spanish into French, like in the conversation, or into English, like many of the panelists are speaking, what that looks like. Have you started to see some of that sort of try to be translated, Ariana?
Yeah, I mean, for example, inclusive language, I think is much harder in Spanish just because it's not only pronouns that you have to change the article, you have to change the noun. So it actually takes a lot more effort. But I think it's being adopted. And actually something that I've noticed is that some schools actually have started to have, which I think is so cool. And I mean, even in my high school that I went to, which I graduated like 8 years ago, so it hasn't been that long, they've since created a gender and sexuality diversity committee. And several schools that I've talked to, for example, the school in Peru that we're going to be performing at, which is actually a pretty conservative school, all female school, they now also they're starting to have a committee. So I think it's very interesting that in the younger generations, there's a lot more openness. I see that there was a question about how do you approach all these subjects when you come from a country that doesn't accept the queer community. And I think the answer really is in the younger generations. Because, I mean, I think it's important to have these conversations with older generations. But as you said, a lot of the language has changed. And I do think that a big part of the barrier is that older generations just feel that the language has evolved so much that they can no longer comprehend. So, I mean, I've had these discussions with uncles of mine about inclusive language, and they're like, no, why? Like, it's just so much work. It doesn't make any sense. Like, it's not grammatically correct. And I try to explain, well, language is always changing. The same way we're talking, even in our own community, how much we've changed and reappropriated words as well. It's constantly flowing. And I'm sure in 5 years, the language that we're using today is not going to be the language that we're using. But the whole idea is that you have to be willing to just let things change and progress as they go. And I think that is something that really alienates an older generation because it's just too much to keep up with. And there's all these language, like, what is heteronormative? I've never heard that word. It just sounds so complicated. And that just really distances them. But with younger students, they're just sponges and they're ready to absorb it. I've never had a student in a workshop that questions the use of inclusive language at all. Whereas every time I perform this with someone from the older generation, there's always somebody commenting, but like, why use inclusive language? It just sounds like you're making a made up language. So I really think that I see a lot of hope in the younger generation, and they're already, because of media, so much more open to these ideas, and they're not as foreign to them. Even if our society in Mexico is much more closed off, the fact that there are TV shows now that show that, both in Mexican TV shows also are starting to produce queer characters, which I think is great. And I think that's going to help a lot. Because when I was a kid, the cartoons were always the princess and the prince, and that was what you had to aspire to.
I think it's really exciting. And one of the ways, at least in American English, when people, especially older people, are asking about why do we have to change our language, I often use things like, well, we have the name Michael, but some people are called Mike and some people are called Mikey, and some people might just go by M. We do that because that's what's true for them. You do that all the time and you don't question it. We're doing that here just in another way. And sometimes if we can connect what they already know and do to different words, it helps them to understand why, rather than to get caught up in what's happening with the details. And even though the details do matter, sometimes getting people just to use, for example, the correct pronouns is more important to not be harmful than making sure they fully understand all the details in the history of pronouns at the very beginning. As we keep talking about language, it's making me really curious. David, for your dissertation work, was everything done in one language? Was it done in multiple languages? What worked best for you in your research?
It was mostly done in English, but we have a creolized sort of English that we speak in Nigeria, Pidgin English, that I use for the storytelling interventions, just in a few places to give a more indigenous feel to the interventions. Yeah.
I wonder, as we are all, learning what we do, and both David and I are working on doctorates, and so we're in the research brain kind of space, and we've got Ace and Ariana on the ground, sort of right in the trenches with things as much too. As we continue to grow, it'll be interesting to see the ways that we pick up from each other, and that we're already seeing in the chat, for example, that someone who works where French is formalized is already looking at how can I take what Ariana's doing and make it work in French, and how can we go into, for example, countries that might not have laws and protections, and take maybe ACE's programming and turn those documents into something that works in different languages, or maybe the same language, but in different countries where it's not so safe. What sorts of safety protections have you put into place where it's not protected, Ariana?
I mean, because we're so far in Mexico, and in Mexico, quote unquote, there is protection, it hasn't been a problem. I think that in general, our biggest hurdle is schools wanting us to go. And you have no idea how many rejections we get from schools. They're just either, sometimes even the teachers are very interested, but they just say, there's no way we're gonna convince the parents. This is just not gonna be worth it. So it's actually, I think that the places that we've managed to go to, already there is some sort of protection, because the fact that they accepted it means that they're at least somebody in that community of the school is willing to allow this to happen, which means that there's a lot more openness. And that is our challenge. We're trying to figure out, how do we get to more schools, because really the schools that most need it are the schools that most reject it. And we're also trying to figure out how, I think, actually, interestingly enough, I think we'll have an easier avenue. We're working towards this, to going to public schools through the Mexico City government. Just because schools in Mexico, absolutely, in Mexico, we have completely separation of church and state, and there cannot be in education any sort of religious taint. So that really, and I do think that the people in charge of bringing programs to schools in general are more open. So there is, interestingly enough, that I think our avenue in public schools is actually easier than in some private schools, especially religious schools. It's just very hard to even enter. So
it's really amazing the way that those sorts of moments are happening, or that we are pushing them to happen. For the awareness of everybody, in the chat, it was shared also that if you're not sure how to work within areas where it is illegal to be LGBT plus identified, there's a website to help called queerglobalcenter.org. Also, if you are watching through Zoom and able, if you've got questions, you can drop them into the Q&A panel. But as people are doing that, I want to grab a question that was asked actually in the last panel or a couple panels back. When we take a look at the idea of, it's about moving from awareness days or months, for example, like Pride Month, to having it within the current curriculum. And that's quite literally what I write. I have a second master's degree specifically in education to write curriculum that I went and got and specialize in adding inclusion into our schools' curriculums, because I agree with them completely on it. But when I'm thinking about it, I think there's a difference from the excellent aspect of putting it into our classrooms and our curriculum, and also self-identifying and bringing that in as our sense of self and who we bring to a classroom. And Ace, you mentioned that you're pretty vocal about your identity. How has that gone, or how much risk has that felt like for you in that process?
Yes. So this is my second school that I've worked at. Like I said, I've been teaching for 6 years. I spent 5 years at my previous school and transitioned while I was there. It was a much more rural school. And when I transitioned, the kids were fantastic. The adults, not so much. And I feel like that's very consistent, like in a lot of places that I've been. So I wound up leaving my job just because of the transphobia and the issues with the caregivers and honestly some of my coworkers, which is really unfortunate. But at my current school, they've been doing this education for a little bit. It wasn't brand new to them like it was at my old school, and it's just a completely different environment. So it still feels like I do take some risks sometimes, especially when advocating for certain things, because I never want to be seen as like someone who's pushing an agenda, because it's not an agenda. It's just making sure that like all of my students and any coworkers, feel safe and included. And I will say that I think I have more straight cisgender accomplices at this location who are willing to put themselves out there, which is really awesome. So I've experienced both ends, and they were very like opposite ends. So it's been a little intense going from one place to the next. But I would say the biggest thing is it's never the kids that or it's very rarely the kids. And if there is ever an issue with a kid, it just takes like a conversation and some education, and they're fine. I love that about like the resiliency and just like the willingness of kids to learn and kind of like just kind of be like, okay, like it's awesome. So that's my kind of perspective.
I think that's a really great point, that the way that people learn may be and often is the intergenerational aspects of things. And as much as we think about adults teach children, we often find in our sort of topic areas that it's the kids who grab it and have to educate then the adults. And some of that comes because when we're using both usualizing and normalizing, kids are normalized that they're supposed to learn things. So when they're taught they as a singular pronoun, okay, they assume we know until they reach a certain age, and then they think all adults are idiots and don't know anything. But in the meantime, they're used to learning from us. It's the adults, especially those who are older than us, who might struggle with the idea that we know something they don't know, and normalizing for them, because for them it is abnormal to learn from someone younger, and then usualizing what we're teaching them. Ariana, how's it been in the age ranges that you present to and work with?
So we started out with the last 2 years of high school, just because that was what high schools were willing to to allow us. And what all the students said was, this has to happen from a much younger age. Everybody more or less agreed, like 7th grade, they wanted this workshop to happen. They were like, it's so important, but it shouldn't be our last years of high school. And again, there's this idea of, why does it have to be, why is it a grown-up subject, right? Because schools were like, okay, well, we'll try it out first with our older kids and see how that goes. And I think even there, you're already putting a stigma on it, thinking that this is a subject that requires you to be older or more mature. So we have had now experiences with younger kids. I think the youngest has been 13. And definitely 13-year-olds are a lot more shocked, but I think less because of LGBTQ issues, but more because just sex is something, as like a subject, is just something that they're starting to talk about, and they might not have heard as much terminology on it. So I think that they're a little more shocked, but then they also participate just as well and have as many questions and as many experiences to share. And I think that this is, I think what really works about this workshop is we use real testimonies from people. And they're all testimonies from people in Mexico. And so suddenly it just opens the door to knowing that there's all these other people who might be going through the same experiences, and being able to feel accompanied, and we have a word in Spanish, acobijado, which means like like having a blanket around you, is I guess the literal translation. But just knowing that you're not alone, I think really is a game changer. I think about my high school experiences, which again wasn't that long ago. And in my class, we were 50 in my class, out of which at least 5 of us were queer. And I think that number has increased with time. But it was hard to talk about, and there was a lot of confusion about what it was, and about having to identify as one thing and it having to be set for life. And I think something that really helps students is to learn that things are fluid and that things can change with time. Gender identity can change with time, sexual orientation can change with time, and it's all within a spectrum. Because I think we're just so used to, as a society, we need to put things in boxes and everything has to fit very neatly. And so then you're overwhelmed as a teenager trying to figure out, am I actually gay? Am I not? What does that mean? But maybe I also feel attraction over here, and what does that mean? And I think that the most feedback we've gotten on these subjects is, oh, what a relief it is to know that I don't have to define myself and put myself in a box right now, or I do, but it doesn't mean it has to be forever. And I think that really comes through the testimonies that we present.
It makes a lot of sense. And I think we're seeing some conversation in the chat about the order of which to educate people. And I am a dual licensed mental health professional in addition to a licensed and trained educator. And what we've actually found consistently in the research is that the importance of equity and belonging has to happen first, because people need to know they're safe, even if they're treated safe by someone who doesn't know why it matters. So we treat people well first. We teach that everyone is different and all the differences are good first. We make sure everyone in the classroom areas at every age are safe. And then we bring them into why does it matter? Why is that difference important? What makes somebody unique and why is that good? And it sounds a lot like David's research, where it really has to be the priority to not harm a queer sibling, because the not harming has to happen whether or not the person knows why they're not harming. What are you seeing for future implications for your research, David?
I think just to add to what you said before I jump into the different questions of my research, I think my approach is more along the lines of not seeing how how our difference makes us how our difference is welcome, but seeing how similar we are. Because going into a space where hate is already boiling, like in Nigerian classroom, and you present perhaps a preliminary survey, and people are immediately like, let's talk about this immediately. Let's tear down this these gays and all of that. But I diverged towards more. No, this is just a survey. Let's discuss first how violence affects everybody, right? On grounds of gender and on grounds of faith, right? Let's see that we hurt similarly and we cry similarly, as opposed to other divergent things. So yes, building, as Ken Plummer would say, building a community of meaning. Let's all agree that this is bad first before we proceed to how it affects us differently. The few applications of my research, I'm not sure really, because right now I'm in SA, South Africa, and I get to go back to Nigeria, and I find that the extent or levels of my visibility are really dependent on how much insulation I have, how much privilege I have. I kind of leverage my institutional affiliations a lot, right? I come from the Center for Human Rights, and we have like a very broad scope of alumni in very high positions in faculties across Nigeria. I'm male as well. I'm very imposing to look at in some spaces. So I'm hardly ever talked down or talked back to, particularly when I position myself as an instructor or a lecturer who holds the space. So perhaps I don't know how long this would hold out, but I'm sure and I accept that it's important to leverage privilege, leverage space, leverage resources available to one at any given time. Yeah.
I think there's a lot to be said for when you laugh at the idea that you're an imposing person. There's part of me that wonders how imposing a person can be if they don't even take themselves that level of seriousness. So I know that we are getting ready to wrap up. So let's take a minute. Ariana, what are your closing thoughts?
Well, I just read one of the comments that asked about having conversations with parents as well. And I think actually that is something we want to explore. We're looking with a school to do this, where we give the same workshop to the kids and the same workshop to the parents in order for them to then have a conversation. Because I think what's very important is, especially in countries where this is not a topic that is easily approached, is really being able to start the conversation. And so I think we haven't done it yet, and I'm very excited to see how it works out. Having parents have the exact same workshop, we're not going to change a single word for the parents, and having discussions separately with the students, with the parents, but then they both go home and have to discuss what they both saw. And that opens a channel of communication between child and parent or caregiver about these topics, and continues the conversation. And hopefully little by little, I think our mission is little by little usualizing, now that I've learned this new word, usualizing talking about sexual and gender diversities, and it not having to be such a taboo subject in society. And at least, even if it doesn't continue the conversation further than child to parent, I think it opens up an avenue, and I think that's a very important avenue to have. So yeah, that's my closing thought.
You know, even when Sue Sanders is not in the room, or maybe, I'm actually not sure at the moment, we will continue to take that usualized word and take with all of the permissions. Let's spread that through all the countries. And as we continue to travel sort of in our international tour, David, what are your closing thoughts from the time zone you're in?
I think building on utilizing as well, we should build around cultural sensitivity. Even while we are visualizing, it's important to be sensitive to the space you're in and to what's at your disposal and to stay alive amidst your work. Yeah.
Staying alive is such a key. And then I think right up there with it is being able to see what we look like in a bunch of different places. And I think one of the greatest opportunities for kids is to see somebody who either identifies the way they do in ways they haven't seen before, or somebody they can learn from who might identify differently. And I don't know that there's a better example of that experience than the students in ACE's classroom. What are your closing thoughts on things, ACE?
I think something that I've learned is this work is as rewarding as it is, it's also incredibly emotional draining. So finding folks who you can lean on to be advocates alongside with you, or kind of push back and be that support. So it's not all on LGBTQ plus folks to do. We have to start. I've been learning to delegate a little bit better as I've been doing this work more. So really leaning on those folks to make to advocate for changes, because the risk is different for them. So I think that would be my closing thought.
I think that's a perfect way to close us out, to think about what are the risks you choose to take because you get the choice, and what are the risks people are forced to take because that's their identity. So if you are somebody and that's your identity, I am a strong believer in following ACE's lead in delegation and self-care. And for those who get to make the choice, please keep making the choice. Please make the choice loudly. And if you need somebody else's lead to follow, our fearless leader of the conference has returned. Thank you to the panel. Let's hear what our leader has to say about things before we move into those workshops. Welcome back. What do you think?
Oh, Chris, there were so many times where I wanted to jump in and share my experience. When Ariana was talking about language, my mother tongue is French, and I know exactly what she's talking about, and I speak Spanish as well. And I think it's really difficult to be inclusive when the language doesn't exist, and even more so in Arabic, you know, which is another one of my languages. So I think that's really, really important. Because it's a lot easier in English, because you can talk about your brother, your sister, or your sibling. You can talk about your partner. You can talk about a pet. You can talk about, yes, so that there are a lot more gender neutral words that can be used as opposed to other languages. So thank you. Chris, I thought you were absolutely phenomenal in terms of sharing. I'm going to take a page and the entire book out of your honestly, I really learned a lot. It was very expertly done. You managed to bring everybody in. You kept it going. It was phenomenal. This is the first time since the beginning of the conference where I actually watched and enjoyed. You know, thank you so much. You did a fantastic job. I want to thank everyone. Ariana, muchas gracias. I'm really, really honored. David, as always, I mean, I think you were there for the first Pride in Education, weren't you? Yeah, so you've been with us since the beginning of the journey, and it's always interesting to hear your voice and your narrative. And I think we're growing stronger and bigger every time we do it. So yeah, absolutely phenomenal. ACE, was lovely to hear your contribution, and I think, as Chris quite rightly summarized, we had like the practitioners on the ground doing it, and then the researchers, and I think it was a really well balanced international panel. So I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart. We've got loads of thank you, fantastic panel. It was very thought-provoking. So the program. We're going to take a very short comfort break, and then we've got a series of workshops. It's on the program, so you can go to the workshop. And after the workshop, I am actually presenting with Griselda and Veronica, and we're looking at an intersectional curriculum in about an hour. So if you want to stay here, we have two movies. Un film en français, a movie in French, which is about homophobia in schools. And we also have another movie called Homo World, which is a movie about everyone is gay and lesbian and the minority is heterosexual. It's something that I used to use in class. And so you're very welcome to stay and watch the movie in 10 minutes, go to the workshop. And I hope you will come back in an hour. I'm going to stop talking about times. In an hour to watch, to look at activism and how to create an inclusive curriculum. David, thank you. Ace, thank you. Chris, I was a fan before. I think now I'm the super fan. I'm going to be the president of the Chris Shane fan club. Like, I really mean it. I think you are phenomenal.
Well, Ollie's going to be drawing the fan club logo. So I'm just going to keep talking about it until Ollie does it. For those of you who don't yet know, Pop and Ollie, check out the books. Stick with Usualizing from Sue Sanders, and tune back in after our comfort break. So much good stuff to come. Thank you, everybody.